What did you find in those relationships between language and stress? What have you learned from that research?
So part of what we were doing is following up on a sequence of studies about language and learning. And so the first tier of studies was just to suggest that if you taught with really, really complicated language, people don't learn well. And that was pretty straightforward. So then the second question, does it do something to the people effectively? Does it stress the students out? And so in trying to design a study, IRB is not excited. Institutional Research Board, who gives us approval for research, they're not excited about doing anything that might potentially stress out a child. So it's not easy research to do. So, of the mechanisms we have possible, one of the things you can do is to give the child some kind of intervention. In our case, all we were doing is teaching two ways: really, really complicated language and simple language, to see how it affected the kids. So I could either do a cortisol test, which is to get a little bit of saliva and test the stress measures. Stress release of that particular cortisol enzyme, but it's expensive, and you try getting that study approved for a public school, it's just not going to work.
Right.
So we use these things called proxy measures. And so proxy measures are measures that are associated with stress but are not measuring stress. What they're actually measuring is reduced mental capacity. So here's one. It's called the Stroop test, and you've probably seen this before. So the Stroop test is, there's a word, and the word will be the word red. So there's two versions of it. It's either written in red, and that's called congruent, where the color matches the word. So red is written in red, and so if you see that, you push the R button. The second is an incongruent, and that's when the letters don't match the color. So the word red might be written in blue. So what you need to do is ignore what the words say and recognize the color. So red written in blue, you click the B button. And so what that does is measure your capacity to engage in dual thinking, to separate one idea from the other, which is a more difficult cognitive task. So we decided to try that as a stress measure, and that's called the Stroop test. The second is a flanker test. Same principle. There's a series of arrows, maybe about 30 arrows. And what you need to do is look at the centermost arrow, identify that centermost arrow, and then click the mouse the direction that the arrow is pointed. So two items: congruent, meaning all the other arrows are pointed the same way as the center arrow. Is pretty easy to do. And then incongruent, which is a more difficult task, which is all the arrows are pointed the opposite direction. So you need to ignore all those other arrows and focus on the centermost arrow. So to study whether or not complex language stress students out, what we did is use these proxy measures, which actually measure mental capacity. And the analogy I like to use again, I was saying, blaring loud music, you're going to parallel park. You can do it, but having more focus helps, right? So we gave them the complex language version and the simple language version, and then we asked them the Stroop and the flanker test. And in all the conditions, the students who were taught with simple language were able to make those recognitions faster. So meaning this, their brain was free. It was more free to be able to recognize this complex cognitive task in both the flanker and the Stroop test. And we found statistically significant differences in the interaction. Now, it was most profound when the task became most difficult in these incongruent items. So when the task became most difficult, those who were taught with simple language were quicker in their capacity to recognize this complexity. So what does that mean for teaching and learning? Something that we already knew already, right? Anytime someone is blabbering at me with really, really complex science language, it is hard for me to hear the idea because I'm struggling to fight through the words, right?
Right.
So it produces limited cognitive capacity. I can't think as clearly. I can't think as quickly. So what that suggests for us is that what we need to do is make sure the idea is first and that people understand the idea. And then we give them opportunity to practice using the language. And so we in our lab group have kind of come across two basic phenomena. Teaching with simple language helps people understand ideas, and teaching with simple language reduces any stress that students might have. At least it frees up cognitive capacity. That's what we can say genuinely.
Yeah, teaching within that context and situating it so that you have the concept experienced before you apply the label to it. That is something that G heavily discusses in a lot of his writings and whatnot. If anyone who's listening is a gamer, G has a lot of writing specifically about video games and education, and it is very on point. As somebody who plays a lot of video games, it just makes a lot of sense. So if you're curious and you're listening to this and you want to learn more about situated language learning, look at some of G's writings. It'll likely make a lot more sense.
And I'm serious when I say a lot of my early work is reading G's work and extending it to the context of science teaching in urban classrooms. I learned a lot from all of his research and have tried to leverage it to extend it. And so his work on gaming is absolutely brilliant around everything from the representation, how situating the need to learn a task before you can move on. There's a lot of brilliance in what video game companies are doing.
Yeah, I was very fortunate that he just happened to be teaching a class at ASU and I was able to take it from him. It was well worth it. This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 53, which is titled Situated Language and Learning with Brian Brown. You can listen to this full episode as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast or by going to jaredoleary.com.